Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Cimpatico Studios where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on Cimpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation Channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, today our guest is Jace Tunnell. Jace is the Reserve Director at the University of Texas Marine Science Institute. His conservation efforts include educating the public about plastic pollution, ushering science and the protection of our natural resources. Jace received a master's degree in marine biology from Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. Jace and I will delve into the environmental impacts of Nurdles, tiny manufacturing plastic that is washing up on the beaches by the millions. He discusses how to prevent Nurdles from getting into our oceans and shares the role of citizen scientists to address this pollution disaster with his data sharing initiative, the Nurdle Patrol. Hey, Jace, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, the Nurdle Patrol. This is this going to be great. I love this. But first, I want to check in. I'm checking with my guest on COVID-19 and how's that impacting your work? What's going on there?
Well, actually, before COVID hit, we were getting in 300 to 400 surveys that people were sending in from all over the country. But with closures of beach, people not wanting to, get very close to each other, our numbers have gone down to about 100 surveys. And so there are some beaches that are still open around the country. And it is a good social distancing type activity. So people have been able to get to the beach, stay, at least 6 feet apart and still be able to collect data. And so we're still getting some in, but it's not near what it was before COVID.
Okay, so let's talk Nurdles. What is a Nurdle and why are they washing up on the beaches?
So Nurdles are the raw material to everything plastic. So think about your sunglasses, parts to your car, the computers we're on right now. All that stuff's made of plastic. And before it was made into that product, it was actually a Nurdle. And so these are lentil-sized plastic pellets that are shipped around the world to factories that melt them down, add color, and then make them into a final product. And so we're finding them washing up on our beaches all over the U.S., even all over the world. We're concentrating our efforts on the U.S. Just because we think that we can change policies to be able to prevent these pellets from getting into the environment. And it is 100% preventable from getting into the environment.
Okay, so where did the name Nurdle come from anyway? That's kind of a name.
Well, yeah, people ask me that all the time and they think I made it up. I'm like, no, that wasn't me. It actually originated in the early 1990s, probably somewhere in Europe. And it's funny because you can ask folks that are in the plastics industry, they've never heard of a Nurdle. They don't call it that. They call it resin pellets or by its type of plastic, low density polyethylene, things like that. So they don't, the Nurdle word, I think, is just a catchy name that somebody came up with because maybe the pellets are small and cute. I don't know.
All right, so I get that they're washing up all over the world. That's how the way the oceans work and such. But are there particular beaches that get more than others? Because, I grew up in Florida, and I think maybe toward the Panhandle, I recall seeing some. But, farther south, I don't recall seeing them. Where are you finding them clustering?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because before we started up this citizen science project, we didn't know. We thought the ones that we were finding on the beach, maybe they came from another country, maybe they came from a spill from a ship. But the more data that we have coming in, it looks like the highest concentrations are up in the bay systems where the plastic manufacturing sites are. And so that's key for whenever you're trying to work with regulatory agencies or you're trying to discuss the problem. Now that we know that the U.S. bay systems have some of the highest concentrations that we're finding anywhere around the country, that allows us to be able to target policies for making change at the state level with these regulatory agencies.
So yeah, I would guess that since the way the oceans work, that they would be almost a non-point source pollution, but they are clustering close to areas of production. So you could almost say they're point source pollution.
Right. Yeah. And in some areas, it's real defined. So there'll be a plastics company that's right next to a creek, and they're the only ones on that creek that makes plastic pellets. So they're easy to say, oh, they're coming from this facility. But then you get up to where we're finding the highest concentrations in the U.S. right now, and that's Galveston Bay. There, they have many different plastic manufacturing sites, and a lot of them drain into the same bayou. And so it's hard to say whose pellets are whose because the chemical makeup of these, as well as the shape and size that you can tell who made them, that's all proprietary information that the chemical companies have. And so the governments don't have that information. We don't have that information. So we can't tie whose pellets go with what manufacturing site currently.
Well, I was going to ask that. Like, is there a fingerprint to individual pellets? And there is, but that's kind of not shared information. But as scientists, couldn't you kind of figure that out anyway? You could just sort of analyze the makeup of it.
Right, and we're actually have some of those studies going on right now at the University of Texas Marine Science Institute. So I work with a professor there, Dr. Jean-Fei Liu, who's looking at that. He has a database of over 10,000 types of plastics, and he's got a $500,000 machine that he can put these little plastic pellets in, and it'll tell him what type of chemicals it was made out of and what type of chemicals have actually absorbed into it, because these things actually act like sponges and they absorb harmful chemicals that are in the environment. And so that's one of the big concerns we have with these pellets is what type of impact is that having on wildlife?
Well, I want to get to that, but I guess I'm still interested about the source of this. That if they're clustering, I guess, more closely to where they're manufactured, what's happening that they're getting out of that, wherever they're produced? I can imagine they're being shipped and everything, but how do they get out just so close to where they're being produced?
Yeah, so there's, as you can imagine, these things are small. The wind can carry them. Once they fall on the ground, they're kind of hard to see because they're so small. But the problem is when it rains and they're on the ground, they get into the nearest river system, then into the bay, then into the ocean, then back up on our beaches. But how are they getting out? They're getting out at every connection point of the supply chain. And so it's not just the manufacturing facilities, which we think is probably where the majority are coming from based on the data we've received. But then, these things are shipped around on rail car, on trucks, and big containers on ships. And there's a possibility of them falling out during that transportation. And then once they get to the site, they have to be offloaded of the rail car or truck. And so there's a possibility of them falling out whenever the fabricators are unloading them. And so there's many different ways they can get out. And we're trying to target each one of those. And so there's different management strategies for each one of those connection points.
Okay, so let's talk about wildlife and I guess the broader environment itself. These things get out there. What damage and what problems are they causing?
So the wild thing is a couple of years ago when I started researching this, one of the main reports that comes up is a 1992 report from the Environmental Protection Agency. And so the EPA had done a lot of different studies in the late 80s and early 90s trying to figure out, where these things are coming from. And then they had sources and recommendations of, how to fix the problem. And in that report, and you can Google it, it's all PDF format available to anyone. There's over 80 species of shorebirds that they knew about at the time that were ingesting these. There's also a list of over four different species of sea turtles that were ingesting these. And so, and a plethora of fish. And so that's where it comes in of saying, it's not just that they're unsightly on the beach, but they're actually having impacts to wildlife. And so some of those impacts include if say a bird eats too many of these, it could clog their intestinal tract. There's no nutritional value, so they could starve to death. We also know that the chemicals that are absorbed into these pellets, they can have issues with reproduction of fish and birds. It can delay reproduction. It can cause a number of other different types of behavioral problems. And so the question I get asked a lot is like, well, what about the fish that are eating these? Does it do those chemicals leach out of the plastic pellets, then get into the muscle tissue that then humans are eating? Because then there's a human health issue. We don't yet have that connection, but I think it's just a matter of time till we have that, because we have the tools and the methodologies to be able to look at that now. And I know that there's research going on. So hopefully in the next few years, we have the answer to that.
Well, I was going to ask that, is it part of the food chain? So it sounds like you're doing research associated with that. There's a lot of focus going on microplastics, but would Nurdles be considered microplastics yet based on the science you have available or how they're breaking down?
Yeah, so these most of the Nurdles we get are around 4 millimeters in size, or even smaller. And so to be a microplastic, it has to be 5 millimeters or smaller. So yeah, these fit into the category. They're the upper size range of a microplastic, but yeah, they're considered microplastic.
Well, I mean, it does sound like you're studying it, but it's just a part of the broader plastic problem that's out there, and inevitably they are going to break down. I mean, just the nature, the basic physics, right? It's going to just break down into smaller and smaller bits.
Yeah, so whenever you go out and you're looking for Nurdles, you'll see a lot of other bits of microplastic, and most of that is from just stuff over decades that is it was a product, and then it broke down over time with wave action and with UV degrading it, and then you'll find pellets within that. But those pellets, this any microplastic, it's not going away; it just gets smaller and smaller and it's more available for animals within the food chain. And so these Nurdles, no, they're not going away in our lifetime, and probably not in our kids' lifetime. And so these are just accumulating, and I think they're accumulating at the rate right now to where it's hard not to find any. And so it's to the point now. And if you look at the map on nurdlepatrol.org, where there's so many that we're finding that we have to do something about it now, rather than push this off to the next generation, which has been what has been done for decades and decades.
Okay, so on that note, let's talk about the Nurdle Patrol. Great name, and you must have a hat or T-shirts, right? You've got all that stuff.
Yeah, we've got all the swag you'd ever want.
I'm saying, you got Cimpatico's got to get some Nurdle Patrol hats or something. I love it. But we sort of understand what it is. But what is the Nurdle Patrol? What are you doing?
So there was a spill here in Corpus Christi, a Nurdle spill, in 2018, and we called the Coast Guard. They called the state agency. Turns out nobody was going to clean it up. There was no responsible party. They thought that all these Nurdles came from a different country or offshore or something like that. And so we asked them, we said, well, are you going to at least monitor it so we know how far it spread and how long it's going to be around? And they said, no, we don't have the manpower. So that's what kicked it off. We said, well, we need citizen scientists that are interested to be able to go out and just spend 10 minutes while you're at the beach and see if you find any Nurdles. And if you do, put them into this database here. And so that's what kicked it off. And to date, we have over 2,100 citizen scientists around the country that have sent data in with over almost 5,800 different surveys. So that's a lot of data. And we're able to do a lot with that. We can put models together that look at currents and wind and rainfall and seeing what the concentrations are during those periods of time. And we really can get closer to seeing where the highest concentrations are and where we need to focus our efforts for education and outreach and policy changes.
Okay, so could you explain what a citizen scientist is? I mean, I'm familiar, but just what are you getting out of it? Who is that really?
So this can be anyone, and we even have school groups that go out. So this is somebody who volunteers their time to go out and collect data. And there's a lot of different citizen science projects around the country, and it's getting more and more popular as budgets for research programs are shrinking. There needs to be a better way to still be able to kind of crowdsource data in a meaningful way. And so this Nurdle Patrol, goes right along with that. And one of the good things about this is we actually got the methodology published. And so with that being done, that means everyone's collecting the data the same way. And we have ways of being able to tell whether they're actually collecting Nurdles or whether they're just collecting seeds or some other bits of plastic. And so that's important for future researchers or for folks that are going to be using this data for litigation. So there are a number of communities that are in lawsuits right now with plastics companies that they know have been, releasing these pellets to the environment. And so they're able to sue them and then use this data to be able to help their case.
But the nature of the Nurdles themselves are so small that you're not really out there picking them up. I mean, you could pick them up just identifying, saying where they're at, but there's not cleanups associated with them, are there?
Yeah, so actually, last week there was actually a big spill in New Orleans on the Mississippi River.
Huh.
And somebody did a survey, and in 20 minutes, they found 500,000. So there's so many. And I saw all the pictures. It was for real. They were just scooping them up by the
Huh.
handful and bagging them up. And so, yeah, there's in some areas, there's enough to where you're just scooping them up by the handful. The others, you're just picking them up, one by one. And so it's not, I'd say the average that we find here in Texas, at least in the coastal bend around Corpus Christi, you find 40 to 100 in a 10-minute period. That's pretty average,
Wow.
which, you might think, well, that maybe that was one spill and it's still lingering. But from the research that we've been doing about looking at different batches, which are how many spills there is in a single sample, I could go out and find 40 pellets, and every single one of those pellets would have a different shape and size. That tells me that that's 40 different spills to make up that one sample, which that's a different way of looking at it. That means that this is a chronic problem that's been happening for a very long time.
I wonder, do you think of maybe just tidal wetlands and such? Could you even look at sort of the soil layers of it and sort of track it? Has it been around that long to even do that?
Yeah, there's some areas where you can tell that these pellets accumulate over a long period of time, and I've always wanted to do that. Is go in and do a core, because they can date the cores, and even as 70 years is a good time frame, so they could go back and see, okay, how long have these things been coming in at this one spot. Uh,
I, I think, unfortunately, that'll be sort of our footprint. 1,000 years from now, scientists will be digging into the substrate and sort of saying, all right, this was a 2020 Nurdle, so
yeah.
inevitably. Okay, I have a question here from the chat here from Mike. And what other coastlines in the U.S. have a really high concentration of these? So you mentioned some of the bays, but are there just beaches that are known for this?
Yeah, so we've had some data come in from Miami that has had really high concentrations, over 100 in 10 minutes. We've also in Charleston, South Carolina. There's a group there called Charleston Waterkeepers, and they're the ones that are in a lawsuit, and they're using the database in their lawsuit to show concentrations that the closer you get to the distribution uh, factory, that's the higher concentrations you get. And so if you go there, you're finding over 100, you can find 200 in a 10-minute period. And I was actually there last fall and was able to go out with that group. And it's insane how many they're finding. And this is way up in the harbor. This isn't coming in from the Atlantic Ocean. This is something happening within their watershed.
All right, so this notion of actually changing policy based on what the Nurdle Patrol is doing and this data that you're collecting, and you sort of alluded to maybe some groups are, I don't know, suing some of the companies that produce this, or let's say it was the barge that it released it, but how are you playing into that discussion?
So I'm working here in Texas with Surfrider Foundation. It's the Texas Coastal Bend chapter of Surfrider, and a lot of people know them. They're real advocates for the beach and clean oceans because there are a lot of surfers. Um, they put out what we're calling a Texas Nurdle bill, and it actually has to do with trying to make mandatory languages in stormwater permitting for plastic manufacturing companies. And so this targets the state agency in Texas that regulates these companies. And right now, in the permits for all plastic manufacturing companies in Texas, the language says that the company is allowed a trace amount of suspended solids. Well, that's a gray area of if an inspector goes out and finds a batch of nurdles in their stormwater that's going to drain out into the ocean, that's a gray area of saying, well, that's a trace amount compared to how many we actually produce. So we're in this Texas Nurdle bill, we're putting in there saying that we want the language to say zero pellet loss to the environment, zero plastic pellet loss. And not only that, we're also incorporating flakes and powders, which is also plastics. And so what has been really good is that currently this Texas Nurdle bill is in the Texas Legislative Council being reviewed, but the state agency is actually being proactive, and they've already put out language that they're saying that they want to change the language in their permits already. And so, this was something that we were pushing for. They saw it. They saw that there was a problem because of all the data on this nurdlepatrol.org, and they're making the change already. And I always say, if we can make the change in Texas, that is a really conservative state and is pro-industry, we can make this change anywhere in the country. And so we're using this as a template to go to other states to try to make the same changes in stormwater permitting.
Oh, I imagine the plastics industry in Texas is incredibly powerful with what you're dealing with. Well, and does that kind of get you into trouble a little bit? I mean, you're with the University of Texas and you're providing this data that could potentially be used, I guess, in lawsuits and all those kind of things. I mean, has that gotten you into trouble a little bit?
If we were involved in the lawsuits, then yes, but we're just in charge of collecting the data and putting the facts out there of what's there. And then, if groups decide to take this data and do a lawsuit, then that's on them. So we don't ever bash any of the plastic manufacturing sites. And actually, we want to work with the plastics industry. And so, it's not this activism type role we're playing. It's more of a science type role. And I've had the plastics industry folks come and take me to lunch and talk to me about the good things they're doing and some of the changes that they want to make on their site, because really they make their money from these plastic pellets. They don't want them in the environment either. And so they just need to be able to make changes on their site and in their distribution of these pellets to where they can account for every single pellet that they produce is not getting lost to the environment.
So is there some sort of gold standard? Is that going to just be industry, I guess, driven, like the supply chain process of making sure when you manufacture, it's really almost down to zero getting out into the environment? Is someone there, even outside the industry, sort of saying, this is how you would accomplish that? Does it get to that level?
Yeah, so the American Chemical Council about a little over 20 years ago came up with this program called Operation Clean Sweep. And it's a voluntary program, but they have in there a lot of best management practices for preventing these plastic pellets from getting into the environment. And so that's one of the things that we're asking regulatory agencies. It's like, look, you have this guidebook already for best management practices. Let's try to make some of these things mandatory within permits and things like that. And so there's already a guidance document and organization out there that knows there's a problem and is trying to give advice to companies for how they can better, prevent pellets from getting into the environment.
Well, we're going to have a wall here for your episode, and we can maybe those recommendations. It's a website or anything, or just a link.
They have a website with videos and all kinds of stuff. It talks about how pellets get out into the environment and then what companies can do to solve the problem.
Excellent. And we're at the end of the episode here, but if someone wants to take action, and I'm even wondering too that even if you don't live on the beach, what can people do to help in this regard?
Well, so you don't even have to live on the beach. It's funny. This week there was a group up in Dallas, Fort Worth, that went out and they went near a plastic manufacturing site, and right next to the fence line, they found tons and tons of plastic pellets. Not tons, but they found a lot of plastic pellets. And so that's a way you can go out, you can look, and all she did was go on Google Earth and she typed in plastic and all the plastic companies came up. And so she was able to see where she wanted to go surveying. And so, she's 6 to 7 hours away from the coast. And so anybody can go out anywhere in the country and get involved. And so if they go to nurdlepatrol.org, we have a training video that's on there. It's a 4-minute training video, show you how to do a survey. We've also created these startup kits that we're going to be giving out for 5 years because we got funding for 5 years to create these kits that will give you all the information you need to start up your own citizen science project or incorporate Nurdle surveys into someone's existing program that they have already. And so all that information is on the website that people can get a hold of us at.
Well, our CEO's in the San Francisco Bay Area. I think we should send him a kit, and he could start in a Nurdle patrol there with Lisa, the co-founder, for sure. I'm in Tucson. Other person is not so much near the beach, but I love this idea. Well, this has been great, and I wish you well. And I guess sort of long-term goals, you're just going to keep what you're doing what you're doing, and I guess there's some science that you want to keep working on. But I mean, yeah, a year out, 5 years out, what are you going to be up to?
Well, because we just received $1 million to expand all across the U.S., we were really concentrated in the Gulf of Mexico. But now we're really expanding to the East Coast, West Coast, up the Mississippi, and into the Great Lakes, as well as some inland states that we know there's a lot of plastic manufacturing sites. That's the real goal, is to take this outside of Texas and the Gulf of Mexico, but really help every state in the U.S. So then we can create change nationwide.
Awesome. Well, Jace, this has been great. And I want to just, if you hold on, I'm going to take you into just chatting, but I want to wrap up this episode. And thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, just hold on one sec.